Shonku Chaterji and welcome to another episode of Editor Social with Cinemaazi Studios. Today we have with us somebody about whom none other than Satyajit Ray once said, "I do not know what definition of a star filmmakers have been using, but mine goes something like this. A star is a person on the screen who continues to be expressive even after he or she has stopped doing anything, who keeps his calm before the camera, projects a personality and evokes empathy. This is a rare breed, but one has met it in our films. Dhritiman Chaterji of Pratidwandi is such a star."
Do you think the war in Vietnam was unpredictable?
Not the war itself, but what it has revealed about the Vietnamese people, about their extraordinary power of resistance. Ordinary people, peasants, and no one knew they had it in them.
We are privileged at Cinemaazi Studios to have Dhritiman Da with us today. Welcome, Dhritiman Da. So, to begin at the beginning, tell us something about your early childhood, something that you have not shared with people. Where were you born, your childhood experience?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid if one is going to get into the autobiographical mode, then it's going to take hours and hours of talking. But even so, very, very briefly, I was born in the middle of the 1940s in my maternal grandfather's place. My maternal grandfather was a very well-known eye surgeon in those days. And to the extended family, he was a doctor. He was the go-to person with any kind of need. And so therefore, things like births of grandchildren and so on, he was the person who was in charge. So it sounds, it sounds like a completely something that people have forgotten. But I was born in the maternity room of my grandfather's very large house in central Calcutta, at the crossing of what was then called Central Avenue, which later came to be known as Chittaranjan Avenue, and Ganashatru Avenue. So the institution of the maternity room, which in Bangla was called, as you know, Atur Ghar, was very, very real then. It's something which people have forgotten now. Hardly any births take place in people's homes any longer. All births take place in hospitals, maternity clinics, and things like that. So, long and the short is that is where I was born. We lived, that is my parents' family, we lived in South Calcutta at the crossing of Lansdowne Road and Hazra Road in a little lane of that. But for one reason or another, a large part of my childhood was actually spent at my grandfather's place and with my grandparents, my uncle, my aunts, and so on. So a very large part of my growing up in the very early days happened there. Well, my father was a geologist. He came from a large, extended family, went to Presidency College, wherein lies a story. Actually, he went to St. Xavier's College to start with. And those were the days of the independence movement. So I don't necessarily want to draw contemporary parallels, but as we know, as we speak now, without naming names, we know that a lot of protests, morchas, rallies, marches are happening now for another kind of independence, you could say. But going back to that time, there were students used to take out, pro-independence rallies at at a rally like that, there was a police lathi charge. My father was injured, and he was rusticated from St. Xavier's College.
Okay.
I don't know the details, but he was rusticated from St. Xavier's College, but was admitted because of his academic.
Presidency did not have a problem.
No, presidency did not have a problem. So he was admitted into Presidency College, where he graduated with geology and went to what was then the premier institute for geology then, which is the Indian School of Mines in Dhanbad.
Okay.
After which he joined the Geological Survey of India, which was one of those, really like the Anthropological Survey, the Survey of India, was one of those really substantial institutions that the British had set up. As it happens, later on, much later, I went to Presidency College as well. But my mother was a homemaker, essentially, but she was also the first woman commerce graduate of Calcutta University. Yeah, my father was the late Gopal Chandra Chaterji, and my mother, the late Aparna Chatterjee. My mother, as I was saying, came to be the first woman commerce graduate, not because she was in love with commerce. She actually wanted to study English literature. But my grandfather, you can kind of, in hindsight, you can interpret these things in various ways. One way of putting it was that he was very liberal, progressive, and so on, which he was. But the progressiveness and the liberality had to be on his terms. So therefore, because he wanted to be liberal, he insisted that my mother study commerce. Equally, my grandmother, I've got pictures of that somewhere. My grandmother learnt horse riding. I'm talking of back in the late 30s, early 40s. I suspect that she had no great wish to be an equestrian, but it was my grandfather who insisted that the women in the family break out of the traditional, Indian woman kind of mold. So there was studying commerce, there was horse riding, there was learning how to drive cars. An aunt of mine became a shooter. My grandfather wanted to get a flying license, which for some reason he could not do. I forget what reason. He could not do in Kolkata, which was, of course, Calcutta then. So off he went to Lahore or Karachi, I forget which, and acquired a flying license. So those were the things that were happening in that household, even before I was born. And, obviously those influences, even if unconsciously, those influences rubbed off on me, rubbed off on my growing up, rubbed off on later on I would say, as it inevitably does, rubbed off on my consciousness in some way or the other.
What role did art and literature play in your?
The first book on cinema that I read was Roger Manuel's film, which my father, that copy is still there somewhere, which was a Penguin paperback. Paperbacks were an innovation at that time, which my father had inscribed and gifted to my mother. So that was the first film book that I read. That was one. both households, ours as well as my grandfather's, they were full of books. They were absolutely full of books. So it was not, as far as I was concerned, at that age, it was not guided reading, but there were glass cases full of books, and one was free to pull out anything uh, and read. Some of which, some of which I understood.
What were the kind of books you were reading?
Yeah, I was just going to tell you that some of which I understood, some of which gave one a secret kind of pleasure, in the sense that, for instance, I read Emile Zola.
Oh.
And Emile Zola Emile Zola dealt with the working class and with the rural. And Emile Zola, certainly for those times, Emile Zola could be quite erotic, or at least so it seemed to a young reader. But there was no censorship. I mean, I don't know whether anybody was keeping track of what I was reading. I don't think so. But so, these things happen. So I remember, these are sort of random recollections. I remember Emile Zola on the one hand. I remember A.J. Cronin on the other hand. And there were the classics, Tolstoy, etc. Not all, and as I said, I was not doing the reading in any comprehensive kind of way, but there was reading going on. Equally important in that reading was the fact that the school I went to, the annual prizes for various things, that of course now seems like, again, another world, but the annual prizes were books.
Even weddings used to have
books. Yes. So, after the annual prize giving ceremony, I and my two brothers, excuse me, we all went to the same school. Depending on how well each had done that year, we came home with stacks of books. So there was a lot of them were comic books. So there was a lot of reading going on from a fairly early age.
And what Bengali authors? You've spoken of Emile Zola and Cronin. Any Bengali authors that were?
Yes, at that time, of course. I mean, no Bengali household is complete without Tagore. And I remember a complete set of Rabindra Rachanavali, which is the complete works of Tagore, from published by Vishwabharati, a very early edition. It must be a 1930s edition, which I still have and have preserved and guarded with my life, as it were. So Rabindranath was there, Rabindranath, Sharat Chandra, people like that. Bankim Chandra, I found very difficult. There were the contemporary authors. I mean, I remember reading more of the authors who were contemporary at that time, such as Tarashankar, such as Vibhuti Bhushan, such as Narendranath Mitra, people like that. But I have to say that for various reasons, the reading in English, for various reasons, the reading in English was more than the reading in Bangla.
Okay. And what was the attitude to cinema in your home when you were a child? This was the time people did not encourage film watching, or it used to be considered, bhalo chelera jay na cinema.
It was I please understand that I'm not saying this to extol my family's aesthetic or artistic sensibilities. I'm just recalling what actually happened, which was that Satya and my grandfathers playing records, which used to be 78 RPM records on the old wind-up gramophones with the little pins. That was a ritual where everybody sat around. My grandfather, of course, presided over the whole thing. And there was my grandmother and my mother and my aunts and the sons-in-law. So listening to recorded film music and collecting the film booklets was very much a part of what happened. Um, so that was one side of it. The other side of it was that, as I was telling you, we lived at the crossing of, in South Calcutta, at the crossing of Lansdowne Road and Hazra Road. From where it was, let us say, a 15-minute walk to the Hajra Park area, where, as you know, there's a whole row of cinema halls, starting with Ujjala, Boshusri, Bijoli, Purno, Indira on this side of the road. So it was in many ways a multiplex which was spread over a not very large area. So therefore, from our home, going to the cinema, or walking to the cinema, was something that we as a family did quite often. In fact, I still remember a story that I was told. A cousin, much older cousin, used to live with us. And when my parents went to see the late night show in those days was at 9 in the evening, my mother put me to sleep and left me in the charge of this cousin. And my parents tell this story of whenever a late night film gave over, which must have been 11:30, 12, something, and they were walking back home after the film, they could hear me crying from a distance because I had woken up and insisted on being taken to where my parents were. So this hapless cousin, there was nothing he could do. So he just put me on his shoulder and was taking me along to the cinema para in the hope that we would encounter my parents somewhere. If they'd still been in the cinema hall, I don't know what he would have done. He probably, I don't know, I'm joking, but he might have just strangled me and chucked me in the nearest dustbin or something.
Do you remember the first film that you watched?
I don't. I don't.
What are your first memories of watching a film?
My first memories of watching a film, okay, I should say another thing here, which is that this whole, just as school encouraged the reading habit, St. Xavier's, of course, the St. Xavier's auditorium is a very old and well-known auditorium. And the St. Xavier's auditorium, which was rare, very, very rare in those days, had a full-fledged 35 millimeter projection room. And there used to be films every Sunday, which children and parents could come to see for a very nominal kind of ticket price. And that's where we saw things like Ten Commandments and so on, that kind of period. But well, I mean, recollections-wise, as I said, I cannot recall the first film, but certainly when I think about that, Potter Machali comes into the Hindi films like Chaudhary Ka Chand, which was, I think, a little later, but more or less.
Even Hindi films were encouraged.
Yeah. Yes, very much. I mean, one hall in particular, if my memory serves me correctly, Boshusri, used to show, I mean, not a majority, but Boshusri used to show a fair number of Hindi films at that time. And this is not directly connected to the question you are asking, but again, it has something to do with some of the unfortunate things that we are going out now, that are happening now about religious divisiveness and cultural divisiveness and so on. But at that time, certainly, I mean, not that one was thinking of it consciously, but if you were watching Hindi films, then inevitably Muslim culture came into it. That was part of the whole consciousness. If you, well, even before that, if you think of Anarkali, uh, Anarkali, Chaudhary Ka Chaat, a little later, Mughal Azam, it was all part of the consciousness, and nobody thought that it was strange or alien or anything like that. So therefore, as I said, it's extraneous to the question you're asking. I think, you know, cultural exchange and being, in the culture is very, very important to a sense of unity and integration.
Tell us something about your school life. What kind of subjects did you find interesting, or what scared you? Were you good at maths, or was it English? That sort of. What kind of subjects you found? Were you good at academics?
Yes, I was. So therefore, it was always a question of, there was no question of, in the sort of, we used to have weekly tests and etc. There was no question. But that again, there was no question of having a rank lower than the third rank. I mean, the third rank would mean a disaster, certainly as far as my mother was concerned. You were expected to come first. There was a concession made if you came second, but beyond that was unthinkable. So, I mean, I don't remember having fought that or resisted that. I sort of, at that age, one kind of doesn't think too much about these things, and
it wasn't a pressure as such.
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, it was, you studied, you played, but then again, it was different from now, in the sense that there was a lot of studying to be done, and in class as well as homework and so on. But there wasn't this business of private tutors and long hours with different private tutors. It was whatever studying was done at home was with the help of the parents. And then that, in no way did that interfere with other activities in school, such as sports, such as drama, things like that. So I would, and parents play a large part in this, of course, but I think the school activity curriculum was, in those days, I don't think that even the teachers and the Jesuit priests, they didn't think of it in these lofty terms of designing the school curriculum so that there is a balance between academics and extracurricular. It just happened. My recollection is that it happened naturally and organically, because you were expected to study, but equally you were expected to take part in outdoor things.
What kind of extracurricular activities were you in? Were you a sports person?
I was a sports person in the sense, okay, in the sense, I think there is a sort of moral in there somewhere. I mean, a psychologist will find a meaning from this. But I was a wicket keeper, and I was a goalkeeper in both football and hockey. So therefore, it was, it was always taking kind of defensive positions. So as I was saying, that there could be a lesson there somewhere which I can't decipher. But that seemed to happen naturally. Not that I was terribly good at any of those things, other than in cricket, it went a little bit forward. At that time, there were, and looking back on it, I feel privileged in a way, because at that time, Karthik Bose, the famous Karthik Bose, he used to conduct nets in Eden Gardens. So I was actually doing nets at Eden Gardens at the age of 8, 10, something like that. And he was a hard taskmaster. And I remember I cracked my thumb being a wicket keeper because there were no inner gloves, and he insisted that you keep wickets to a single stump. And as I said, he was a hard taskmaster. I remember that was the time when an Australian team with Norman O'Neill in it had come to India for a series, and they were in Kolkata, and some of these figures were legends to me. And as it happens, it's strange how these random memories stick to you. I remember as I was batting, a ball outside the off stump, which I drove to the leg side. And Karthik Bose was wild. He said, first learn the basics. Don't think you're going to be Norman O'Neill. And I do not want you to play balls outside the off stump to the leg. So, but these are things, these are lessons which, stick to you. But, my career or my whatever ambitions I may have had in sports were very short-lived. That was not one of my strong points. It was more, I used to love to read, school dramatics, and we used to have another institution. I don't think that exists now. There used to be a thing called an elocution contest, yes, which was very, and for which you were free to choose the pieces that you wanted, either poetry pieces or prose pieces. And both my parents took an active interest in that, in choosing the pieces as well as in coaching. Which reminds me of two incidents. One was when we had chosen Swami Vivekananda's very well-known address to the World Parliament of Religions, which caused a problem with the Jesuit priests because he speaks about various languages being like rivers which converge in the same sea, which gave the impression that all religions, I mean, it is very much a lesson for today. Yes. It is absolutely a lesson for today, but which gave the impression that all languages, all religions were the same, which I don't think the priests liked very much. But, again, so that was one. The other one was when the Belgian Congo became independent. And Patrice Lumumba, who was, as we know, was Marxist, his speech on assuming the prime ministership, very powerful speech. Both of these, the authorities, the priests, had objections to. But, those were different times in the sense that finally I got to deliver both. And it was a question of my father going to school, talking about it, reasoning about it with the priests involved and resolving it. If this had happened today, can you imagine what would have happened? I mean, dharnas at the school, television descending, politicians descending. Things weren't so confrontational and aggressive back then. I mean, reasoning, civilized discussion still had a huge space. And that is the sort of, it's best to use the Urdu word tehzeeb. That is the tehzeeb that we absorbed and grew up.
You eventually came to Delhi, yeah. But was that the beginning of your college life, or was that
No, what happened was after there again, I mean, call it parental pressure or call it, I mean, obviously in those days, people our age, just when you're in school, when you're getting out of school, we had far less autonomy than children do now, and far less control over our lives in the sense of what we would do in the future and so on. So, because as it happens, fortunately or unfortunately, looking back sometimes, it seems like unfortunately, because unfortunately I was a good student. The natural assumption in those days, if you were a good student, was that you would become an engineer, or a doctor, or in accounts, something to do with finance, or that's right. That's right. So that was the. So therefore, I was persuaded, let us say, to go to the Bengal Engineering College in Shibpur, which, I mean, those were the, as I remember, those were the very early days of the IITs. So therefore, Bengal Engineering College was a premier institution. It was an old institution, and it was a premier institution in engineering. And I mean, if you got admission into the Bengal Engineering College, then prospective, I mean, fathers of daughters would almost sort of bequeath their daughters to you in advance, kind of thing. I mean, that was the stature that Bengal Engineering College had. So, off I went to Bengal Engineering College, but very quickly found that it was not for me. I mean, it was not for me because, the science subjects and maths and so on, that is not where my natural inclination lay. That was one. And two is very practical things, such as you had to go to class. I mean, Bengal Engineering College, as you know, is next to the old botanical gardens in Shibpur near Calcutta. It is on the river. So it's a very pleasant, natural surroundings. But in spite of that, I mean, things like you had to go to class at 7:30 in the morning. There was something primitive I remember, called the Smithy workshop. In the Smithy workshop, you stuck bits of iron into a fire, and then you beat the hell out of them to turn them into various shapes. Even at that time, for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what that had to do with becoming an engineer. Yeah. But it had been happening for, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, so it was still happening. So there was that, or doing things which I thought were completely irrelevant to. And then, of course, the very important thing is that there were, in engineering college back then, in your class, there were very few girls. I mean, that was very, very important. I mean, it was absolutely important. There were very few girls, and you could literally count them on the fingers of one hand. And they were all, the girls that they were all in architecture. And for some unfathomable reason, my father had decided that I should go into metallurgy. Okay. I mean, thinking back on it, it's one of the most absurd. It's very surreal. I mean, I cannot for the life of me imagine what I could possibly have to do with metallurgy. But there I was in BE College, studying to become a metallurgist. And I had a friend who knew he wanted to be a metallurgist. His mind was set, etc., etc. So he wanted to be a metallurgist. And on Saturday, and we obviously used to live in the hostel in BE College. And on Saturdays, you packed your bag, got into the 8B bus. And the 8B bus, as it happens, came to the locality in which we lived. But we made a stop at College Street. And off we went, made a beeline for the College Street Coffee House. So some time was spent in the College Street Coffee House, and then you went home. That's how it worked. And in College Street Coffee House, you met friends who had made the much more sensible decision, or their parents had made it for them, of joining Presidency, Scottish Church, colleges in that neighborhood. So you met them, and you met their not girlfriends, but their girl co-students. And so then I kept wondering, what am I doing cloistered in an engineering college? This is my environment. So after a year, I told my parents, that's it. At that time, dropping a year, if you were a good student, dropping a year, giving up a college that some students would give their right arm for, was unheard of. So I don't clearly remember the negotiations that took place, but I was able to hold firm and negotiate, and had to hear things from other relatives who were also aghast. Had to hear things like, oh, B college ছেড়ে Presidency College, সেখানে arts পড়বে, arts তো মেয়েরা পড়ে, only girls study arts, things like that. So, but in spite of that, one was able to make the change. And again, I don't think that I had any great or fixed notions of becoming an economist then, but economics seemed to be a good kind of via media. Also, economics, there were a few subjects in Presidency College at that time. Economics, English literature, physics were subjects that were considered, plum subjects, just as they were indeed in St. Stephen's College in Delhi at the time. So economics seemed to be a reasonable kind of, alternative. And, in those days, things were uncomplicated, in the sense that I told my Presidency College friends that this is what I want to do. So how do I go about it? They said, go and meet the principal. The principal was Dr. Bhavatosh Datta, who was a very renowned economist. So, an outsider, I'm not a student of the college, but meeting the principal was no big deal. Okay. Went and met him, he said, yes, what? I said, this is my background, this is what I'm doing, but I want to join the economics department. So he said, okay, there's an entrance exam happening in such and such. Go and do it. Head of the economics department was Dr. Taposh Majumdar, another renowned economist of the time. So that's how it happened. So that's how,
And from Presidency to Delhi School?
Yeah, Presidency to Delhi School. By the time one was finishing one's undergraduate course, the turbulence in West Bengal politics had started, which was affecting colleges. So, agitations, exams being postponed indefinitely, that sort of thing had started to creep in. And one of the problems that Calcutta University was finding was that, as a result of all this, results were being postponed and postponed and postponed and postponed. So therefore, doing post-graduation in Calcutta University would have been difficult just in terms of time. Yeah. So therefore, the decision was taken, as I remember, jointly to come to Delhi, which, just the fact of, making the move to another environment, that was very attractive to me. And of course, Presidency, that is Delhi School of Economics, at that time had people had a number of people. I mean, it was a really stellar faculty at that time, and a number of people, as it happens, with Kolkata background. Professor Topun Rai Chaudhary was director, and there was Amartya Sen, Shukumar Chakraborty, Kolkata people essentially. Of course, there were other very distinguished people, all of whom I was privileged to study under, like Jagdish Bhagwati. So, long and the short of it is that these people who took the decisions, they knew, what was happening in Kolkata. So, therefore, I think, as I recall, 4 or 5 of us who came from Presidency, we were given admission without even before the BA results were published. So therefore, the BA results came out only after we had completed the first year of MA, which was then called MA Previous. So, and the understanding was that, MA Previous exams, by that time, in the unlikely event that you have flunked your BA exams, then you will have to leave, of course, but otherwise, it's fine. So that kind of leeway, I don't know whether it would be available now. Delhi School of Economics, in many ways, partly because Dr. K.N. Raj was there, so it was a stellar time. And because of their academic backgrounds, they'd all obviously been to universities abroad and so on. So there was a very open kind of, for example, I remember that a poll was taken among students whether, this business of compulsory attendance, which was still there in Calcutta, you had to have 75% attendance, otherwise terrible things would happen, whether attendance should be made compulsory. Most students said, no, it shouldn't be. It should be up to the student. But the thing is that there were certain professors whose classes were houseful, in spite of attendance not being compulsory. And there were other professors, unfortunately, whose classes were ill-attended. So a lot of autonomy was given to, after all, that was the whole thing, that these people, the students there, nobody has sort of held them by the scruff of their neck and pushed them to study MA. If they are studying MA, it's because they want to do it and they're of a certain age. So leave it up to them to decide what's good for themselves. So that was the...
You mentioned the political situation in Bengal and all of that, and being part of Presidency College, it was obviously the hub of political tension.
One of the hubs, yes.
Were you a politically inclined student? Were you part of that unrest, or did you?
There were two, at that time, there were two factions. One was the Students' Federation, and the other was PCSO, Presidency College Students' Organization. I was a part, now, the PCSO was by, to draw a parallel and to clear misconceptions, the PCSO was by no means the equivalent of the ABVP or anything. It was not a right-wing organization. It was just that there, it, in many ways, I would say, it was like Labour and Conservative in British politics, which is not to say that all Conservatives are rabid right-wingers. That is not the case at all. Unfortunately, it's becoming like that now, but it was never the case. It was people who thought that conservatism was a value to be nurtured. So, and also a counterpoint, a counterbalance to... So it was like that. It was the SFI, which was nominally Marxist, because there were these stated or unstated connections to the Communist Party, and a counterpoint to that, because everything needs to have a counterbalance. I mean, my seniors who were part of PCS, so I can, as we carry on, I can name one or two, were very liberal, progressive people, but very progressive people. But they felt that the SFI needed a balancing. So that is how come PCS. And that was on the one hand. But on the other hand, I mean, my two closest friends, who are still good friends, were Dhritiman Chaterji, who later, of course, involved himself or dedicated himself to extreme left-wing politics. But within the left-wing system, another person who later went into politics was Sudarshan Rai Chaudhary, CPI Marxist. So they were very close friends. So unlike now, it wasn't that you had your claws out at anybody who was politically different from you. And as I said, there was progressivism and there was conservatism on both sides, So that is a short history of my sort of college politics. It is true that I did not step beyond the boundary of, like many of my extreme left-wing friends did. I did not do that. But, I was reasonably active in the student union election, that kind of universe at that time.
Welcome back to Cinemaazi Studios Editor Social with Dhritiman Chaterji. And as we delve into his career in cinema, we are surrounded by cinema cans all around us. Dhritimanda, was a career in cinema a part of your thought process while you were a student in Delhi School of Economics?
Not at all. Not in the slightest bit. Except that there was always, as I was telling you a little earlier, and let me go back to that a little bit. I mentioned the fact that the first book on film that I read was something that my father had gifted my mother long back in the early 1950s. Apart from that, there were two other influences, or, they became influences. One was that as a geologist, my father had to take a lot of pictures, landscapes, rocks, things like that. So therefore, he had this, mouth-watering cameras that had been given to him by the Geological Survey. One was a twin-lens reflex Rolly, I remember, and one was a 35mm Zeiss icon. It seemed fascinating to me as a child, a lovely leather box full of filters. And he also liked photography. So quite apart from pictures that he had to take professionally, he took pictures, and obviously a geologist's life involved a lot of travel to remote places. And as it happens, we as children and my mother, every year without fail during the winter holidays, used to accompany him on those travels. So, places like Jaisalmer, Pokhran in Rajasthan, other places in Madhya Pradesh, way back in the 1950s, we have visited before they became, part of the sort of tourist circuit. Bhutan, we went to Bhutan long before travelers started going to Bhutan. So that was one thing which was kind of shaping, if you want, a visual kind of consciousness. That was one. The other thing was, again, my parents were members of, at that time, in mid-50s, early 60s, the Film Society movement was very, very active and strong in Kolkata. The Calcutta Film Society and the yes, and the Cine Club of Calcutta. They were members. Excuse me. So there was a lot of cinema watching.
Okay.
So, you know, somehow cinema was kind of in the consciousness. And then, as I remember, in the early 60s, this whole package of French new wave films, Godard, Truffaut, this whole package came to India, came to Calcutta. So that was another influence. Delhi School of Economics, group of friends and I started Delhi University's first film society called Celluloid. And at that time, watching films, of course, there was the Federation of Film Societies. And it was lovely that we had access, even as students, we had access to some of the embassies here. So, for example, I remember that very fondly. At that time, there was a Canadian animator called Norman McLaren. He used to make very unusual animation films. So we used to go to the Canadian embassy. I remember there was a room with mats on the floor and cushions, sit back there and watch Norman McLaren. So that was that. Celluloid, we wanted to bring out a film magazine. So therefore, writing to Rai, writing to Mrinal Sen, writing to Shyam Benegal, writing to Shanti Chaudhary, who was a documentary filmmaker in Calcutta. So first contact with these people. So therefore, there was that. But there was a great deal of interest in cinema, but no dreams or ambitions of being an actor. I was active on the stage. While in Delhi University, we used to do plays, and Delhi University, particularly St. Stephen's College, had a very, very rich tradition of theatre. So in a sense, one was part of that. I still remember at that time, some people who became very well known for other reasons, but who were very good actors, Kapil Sibal, Wajahat Habibullah. We have acted together in The Man for All Seasons, where, as it happens, I played Thomas More. So you know, there was that. But that didn't mean that, you know, I had plans in my mind, okay, I love the stage, I love cinema, acting is working out for me, so therefore I'll become a film actor. There was none of that.
You had a very interesting story about Mrinal Sen, sort of you writing to Mrinal Sen and being very intellectual about some cinema, and he giving you a tongue lashing about that.
Tongue lashing. That also happened at the same time when we were getting in touch with people about writing for the magazine. Of course, at that time, getting in touch with people was not as easy as it is now. You either wrote letters, or I used to live in Jubilee Hall in the North Campus, and there was this one public telephone kiosk on the ground floor. So you went there, you booked a trunk call, which in itself was expensive. You booked a trunk call, and then you waited and hoped and prayed that the call would come through. So that was how you got in touch with people. Anyway, as far as Mrinalda was concerned, he'd started at that time sort of becoming new wave-ish, if I can put it that way. He was using techniques like jump cut, freeze. So, you know, draft questionnaire. So I had sort of told Mrinalda that, you know, one question could be, how much has the French New Wave, and particularly the techniques, the cinematic techniques that the French New Wave is using, how much do they influence you? He didn't take too kindly to that, I have to say. He said, please don't, first let's talk about the basics. Please don't try and show how much you know about cinema. But of course, he was a wonderful person. I mean, that was just something he'd said. But we became very good friends after that.
What kind of films, you mentioned a lot of internet, going to embassies and starting this film society. What were the kind of films you were watching at this point of time? Do you remember? What are the kind of...
Well, French New Wave, as I said, came as a breath of fresh air. Fresh air meaning very novel. Other than that, it was a lot of Bergman, whom I admired, Fellini.
And you used to get these films easily for the society to screen?
You know, the Federation of Film Societies was very active at that time. So, you know, the Federation of Film Societies was bringing packages like this down anyway. And some of those we managed to get for our university film society, that is to say, celluloid, and screen them. So those were the greats whom we were watching and whom we admired at that time.
Welcome back to Cinemaazi Studios Editor Social, and we are with Dhritimanda talking about his journey through cinema. Dhritimanda, after your days at Delhi School of Economics, since you weren't thinking of a career in cinema, what were the career options you were exploring at that time?
Okay, let me start by saying that I have never been, particularly in terms of planning my life, I have never been terribly organized. I've never been good at long-term planning. Maybe we'll talk more about that later, like with everything else in life. There are upsides and downsides to that, but we'll come to that maybe later. So in answer to your question, even after Delhi School of Economics, I was not really sure what I wanted to do. I mean, I remember that I half-heartedly contemplated or toyed with the idea of prolonging my tryst with economics, in the sense of doing the usual things people at that time were doing and do now. You've done a postgraduate degree from a premier institution, so therefore you go abroad for a PhD. And then at that time, one of the paths that led you to was that it almost became a joke that Delhi School of Economics, MA, PhD from wherever in the US, World Bank was the kind of linear progression. So I will not deny that I toyed with that and perhaps even half-heartedly applied for a PhD to one or two universities, but that really was, I mean, my heart was not in it. And that's one. Two was that cinema was in the back of my mind. I didn't know, as I was saying a little earlier, I mean, there were no great ambitions to join the film industry and become a big actor or a star and pursue that as a career. But something to do with cinema was there on the horizon. And then, of course, there were, I mean, with a degree like that, which gave you, bad word, but that's actually what it did, a degree like that in the institutions that you'd gone to gave you pedigree. It's as simple as that. And with that pedigree, you got fairly easily, not fairly easily, but you got into banks and you got into the plum companies in those days, such as the Plumbist, if that is the correct word. The Plumbist was, as I remember, Hindustan Lever, banks such as Grindlays. So those were the career options you followed. I wanted a break from all this. Not to have to think about it. Family was either supportive or by that time family had just given up. I mean, having switched from engineering to economics, family sort of was kind of saying, what we say in Bangla, "Tomar ja ichhe tai koro goche." That was. So I did this very unusual thing after I came back to Kolkata from Delhi. of joining All India Radio as an announcer, which was, people thought, what is going on with this person? I mean, St. Xavier's School, Presidency College, Delhi School of Economics, then he becomes an All India Radio announcer. What is going on? But I did. And, the year or two I spent there was wonderful because it was carefree, it was doing something that I liked, being in a studio. And that was the time when the commercial services of All India Radio, Vivid Bharati, had started. And my claim to fame, as far as qualifications for Vivid Bharati was concerned, was that I spoke Bangla, Hindi, and English reasonably well. So therefore, in the commercial service, you needed all these three languages. But the Director General of All India Radio, who had come down to Kolkata for the interviews, and I went in for the interviews, he was also stunned. He said, look, your father was this very senior, well-respected scientist and government servant. This is your academic background. Why do you want to become an announcer? To which I did not have an answer, but an announcer I became. So that was a marking time, trying to figure out what to do.
What kind of experiences, if you could share a bit about your AIR experiences, how many years were you with?
As I remember, I was not there for very long. Between a year or two, it had moved into its new premises, spanking new premises near the Maidan at that time. So that was one. Two was, that was because there wasn't so much media. You didn't get to see celebrities in the flesh and blood. But when you're in All India Radio, this new premises had a back gate, which the other day actually I was wandering around just for old time's sake in those areas. That back gate still is there. And outside the back gate, there were chai dukan and snacks at dukan, stalls, which are still there. So therefore, when you were in your free time, you used to congregate there for adda and a cigarette and drinking tea. And that is when we used to see legends enter, like Ustad Karamatullah Khan Sahib, people like that. And you used to look at them with wonder. Because flesh and blood contact with celebrities was not that easy then. So that was one side of it. The second side of it was, again, it was my introduction to technology in the sense of magnetic tape, records, all that, mics, speaking in your voice control, speaking into mics. I have to say that even when I was at Delhi School of Economics, just to make some pocket money, I had become a newsreader in the external services of All India Radio, which meant going to the All India Radio studios. Of course, transport used to pick me up at the dead of night, which was not pleasant in Delhi winters. And the thing is that at that time, that experience and my experience as an announcer in Akashvani, Kolkata, all of it was self-taught. There were no classes, orientation courses, nothing happening. You picked up from your seniors and you learned by doing. And along the way, you made mistakes. I mean, for example, I liked the idea when one used to listen to people like Chakrapani and Melvin DeMello as newsreaders. There was always this feeling, I wish I was doing that kind of thing, which is why But I remember the first time around when I went to read the news, there you are, there's the mic. I forget, it was, a 5-minute telecast or something. I finished in 3 minutes flat. Mm-hmm. And there was major consternation of how to fill in 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. So they said that, why did you read so fast? I said, I don't know any better. And my fear is always that I'm going to overstep. So one has the tendency to hasten things up. Kolkata also was learning by doing. I was very, very fortunate at that time, looking back on it, in having as a colleague Pratidwandi Chaudhary.
Who subsequently directed you also?
Who subsequently directed it, but before that, he had made a film called Chayashurjo with Shomila Thakur, which was critically acclaimed. I think it got a national award. Commercially, it was reasonably successful. And if I'm not mistaken, I may be mistaken, but I don't think I am, he'd also made a film with 2 or 3 Rabindranath Tagore stories.
Okay.
But had then fallen on bad times because some of his work had not been commercially successful, so he was not being able to make films. He had to earn a living. I mean, he had this theatre group called Sundaram, which Sundaram then was Manoj Mitro and so on subsequently. So that was a well-known theatre group, but he had to make a living. So he joined All India Radio as an announcer. And Parthoda, as a person, was very experimental. So he used to try, he used to get up to naughty tricks also, and I was an accomplice on some of those. But he also used to, for instance, as I told you, the two media at that time were the good old long playing record and the quarter-inch tape. So sometimes you were playing music from one, sometimes from the other. So Parthoda's point was, look, fine, but can't we figure out a way of going from one to the other smoothly? Like doing a smooth mix, which is the easiest thing in the world now, but at that time it didn't used to be. If you want to go from a precise point to a precise point. So something had to be devised. So what was devised? The long playing record, you listened to it once and figured out the out point that you wanted to go out from. And you made a chalk mark there.
Okay.
Similarly, on the tape, you figured the in point and you put a paper flag there. And then you went from one to the other and it was smooth. At that time, there used to be, because it was a commercial program, there used to be this person called the duty officer. The duty officer were people who had been announcers and so forth. They'd got a promotion, so now they sat in sort of the front office and listened to everything and recorded everything so that there were no complaints from advertisers. Now, we had one duty officer who was technically very competent. There's a story in that, I'll come to that, who was technically very competent and he was very sympathetic and we were fond of him. I forget his name. But he told us, how did you do this? We've not been able to do this. So Parthoda said, this is how we did. So because of interest in cinema, there was a lot of discussion of cinema. The story I was going to, it is in the context of nothing at all. But this duty officer, when there were late night shifts, late night shifts as in, say, about 10:30 in the evening, which in those days was late enough. This person used to come and insisted on making one of the announcements. Okay. And we used to wonder why. Then we gathered up the courage of asking him that, why do you make this announcement late in the evening? Why? So he said, I didn't want to say it, but it is just to prove to my wife that I'm actually in the studio and I'm not elsewhere. That's why he used to come. So All India Radio, carefree, not a thought about the future, doing all these things, meeting lovely people like Borun Haldar, who was then the musical bandbox man. So it was a wonderful time. But like all wonderful times, it had to come to an end. So therefore, finally, I succumbed to I succumbed to the corporate allure and joined what was in those days a very blue chip company called Metal Box as a management trainee. And so my life sort of took another kind of route.
How did Pratidwandi come into the picture in the middle of from AIR to your corporate avatar, and when did Pratidwandi start to germinate or originate?
Pratidwandi started to happen when it started to germinate, when I was at Metal Box and enjoying some bits of it, not enjoying other bits of it, sort of, you know, not enjoying in the slightest bit, while enjoying what I was doing at that time, because that also brought with it a lot of other experiences. And, subsequently, I have, maybe we'll talk about that, but subsequently now, for instance, I have started to believe that every experience, whether it's what we call a good experience or whether it's a bad experience in whatever way, health-wise, finance-wise, whatever it is, every experience is valuable because it enriches you. Every experience. In retrospect, I find that whatever I think is not positive that has happened to me has been valuable in some way. So therefore, Metal Box also, working in a factory, and there, Metal Box, as indeed some of the blue chip companies at that time, manufacturing companies at that time, even if you were a management trainee, which means you were prized, but you had to go through the paces. You had to keep factory hours, eat in the factory canteen, supervise the production lines. You had to learn everything, interact with the workers, interact with the union, all that. So, in retrospect, all of that was new, all of that was novel, all of that has contributed in some way, which maybe I can't even articulate, in some way of making me what I am today. So, valuable experience, and of course, meeting very interesting people along the way. So, there was that. Somewhere along this, the interest in cinema continued, film society, shows, all of that continued. And then came the news from a close friend, from a family friend, that Satyajit Ray was casting for this new film he was going to make called Pratidwandi, which in English became known as The Adversary. He was going to make this film. And that it was going to be somewhat, the Hindi word, I suppose, is hatke from the cinema that Satyajit Ray had made till then, and that he was looking for a new person to play the protagonist. Now, this friend was a very close friend from school, college days. He was part of the, in a sense, part of the extended Rai family, in the sense that, they lived in the house from which Shandesh came out. So he said, go meet him. I had made Rai just once before, in the Delhi School of Economics days, when, as I told you, we were trying to bring out this magazine. So I'd been to Rai's house. He was very welcoming. And of course, those were really different days in the sense that there was this great man. You rang the bell, he opened the door. There were no firewalls of secretaries and security guards and all that garbage that you have now, where even the, most sort of minor functionary, I will not name them, but have huge firewalls around them. Anyway, so there was that. So I told him, we've corresponded. So I've come for this magazine. So he said, Jay, I'm just going to the Montreal Film Festival. So leave your questions behind. Certainly, I'll respond. So this was the second time we were meeting. He used to live that time in this house in South Calcutta in Lake Temple Road. So we met, and he chatted for a long time. Thereby also hangs a tale, thereby this chatting for a long time thing. Then he said that you have to do what is known as a screen test, so come to Indrapuri studio. I went. So no makeup, no nothing. He said, these lines, you're talking to a friend, say these lines. Said those lines. Then I forget in detail what happened, but 3 or 4 days later, I think, the thing was done, you're on. But that done, you're on is all very well. But that was, in a sense, where my problems began. Because I was working for a very pakka British company called Metalbox, whom I had to ask for permission. I mean, I was not about to, give up my job in order to...
Okay, not even for Ray?
No, because as I said, I wasn't seeing it as the beginning of a career, of an acting career. I was actually seeing it as a great opportunity to observe Rai work at close quarters. Really, that was it. In a sense, the fact that I was playing this role, exciting though it was, in a sense, that was secondary, really. The first thing was seeing this man work. So, major sort of heartburn at how can a metal box executive act in cinema, because cinema even then was cinema. Entertainment. It's not. If I had said that I am going to sing an aria in a concert, that may have been more acceptable. But cinema, acting. Fortunately, we had one senior, Mr. Aurobindo Ray, who was steeped in, I admire the person, he passed away not so long ago, who was, even though he worked, you see, the thing about companies like in those days, what we call the Shaibi or the Vilaiti companies, the Boxwala companies, yeah. Again, it was a colonial hangover, was that when you join those companies, you shed your ethnic identity as quickly as possible. That just went out of the window deliberately. You became a Shaib. You didn't remain a Bengali or a Bihari or a person from Madras. You became, to the extent possible, a Shaib. But there was this, and you adopted Strange, which also is a British public school kind of tradition, which existed to a very large extent in St. Stephen's College, which was also very Shaibi once upon a time. You adopted very strange pet names.
Okay.
I remember there was a gentleman called P.R. Das. I don't even know whether I should be naming him, but he had the PR extended into a very, very Bengali, old-fashioned Bengali name. So PR Das became Taki Das. So, like that. People became Taki, Jimmy, Bob, Fred, etc. So identity had to be shed as rapidly as possible. In all of this, there was this gentleman called Aurobindo Ray who was steeped in Bangla literature, culture, Bangla music, Shotitra. So he convinced people that, all right, there's nothing wrong with it. Shotitra is not your commoner garden filmmaker. It's culturally acceptable to work with him. So I was given permission. And also, of course, the fact that in those days, in Rai's kind of cinema, which was low budget, things had to happen fast. So it was not a question of taking off for 5 months or 6 months. It was a question of taking off, as I remember, for actually less than a month. So it was all right.
How did Ray groom you as an actor? Because this was the first on screen, camera before the camera assignment, so to speak, stage may have happened, but what was the grooming like? What was it that he taught you, held your hand and took you through? What was it like?
Well, the short answer to that is he didn't.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
As I told you, that the fact that when we met, we chatted for a long time,
Yes.
and I told you that there I hangs a tale.
Yeah.
This is, I mean, I've later, of course, I've had long conversations with Rai on cinema, anthropology, politics, philosophy, da. And I've never asked him about this, but later I realized that with newcomers, the reason why he talked and talked and talked and talked on first meeting was to closely observe the person, observe manner of speaking, what we now call body language, gesticulations, etc. And then incorporate these elements into the character. Which is why, Rai, everybody used to say that he's so fabulous with newcomers, he's so fabulous with non-actors. I believe, although as I said, I've never talked about this with him, I believe one of the reasons was his close observation of individuals and incorporating that when he finally wrote the character, so that things became normal, things became easy. And of course, the fact that the character of Siddhartha that I was playing, that person, as an individual, as a human, that person I knew, that could be me. I mean, unemployed at one point, conflicted, some political views, but not involvement. That was a child, that was a young man of the times. A little more on Rai's way with actors. This is all that I have observed. As I was saying, I've not talked to him.
Yeah.
But I noticed, even with Pratidwandi, and later with other films which I was seeing from the outside, I was not a part of, that he had two ways of working with actors. One was, as I said, the way he worked with me, which is script reading, giving me script, dialogue, and then more or less leaving me to do what I wanted to do. Apart from one or two occasions when he would say very gently, will you just try it this way once? So that was one way. The other way was where an actor, he would direct, even in the shot. I mean, at that time, dubbing had come in, so there was no problem in the director speaking while the shot was on, of saying, okay, now stop, now look to your left, now lower your head, now look in. So that was another method of direction, where he would direct absolutely precisely, every gesture, every look, every move. I am reluctant to say that he followed this second method with less able actors. I don't know that, who am I to say that? But all I can say is that these are two distinct methods of his working with actors that I have seen.
Had you read the novel before? Did you read? Was that part of the preparation?
No. Thereby also hangs the tale. No, you see, what Raya used to do, even right up till the end, is that he'd have a reading where he'd call everybody associated with the film. The actor, cinematographer, editor, art director, everybody over, and read the script from beginning to end. So that happened. But, I've been asked this question a number of times. I have always felt at that time and till today that my primary obligation is to the screenplay and to the director's vision to the extent that I have been able to understand it through discussion, etc. That is my primary obligation. My obligation is not to the source material. So that I have, except in a very few exceptions, which we will come to if you want, I have, where the screenplay and what I have understood of what the director's bigger picture, where I've made it a point not to read the original until the film is over and done with. This has happened in a number of cases because I felt that if I try to become the critic and the interpreter, then there will be confusion. So let me not get into that. So that is the way that I've.
Do you remember the first shot you gave for the film? Is that a very clear memory? Like what it was like? You know, like
as I remember, it was in the house. Me talking to my brother, who was played by Devraj Rai. We were having one of these, very sort of quiet of night type conversations about his political beliefs. So it was that conversation. And that again, I think, in a way, Satyajit Ray deliberately, of actor's first shot, obviously he's feeling a little uncertain about this new experience. So do a basic instead of doing something very complicated involving movement, moving from here to there. Do something which is relatively easy.
Yeah. So there's something that I'll come to after this question. We'll park this as a thought regarding the political belief of this character, Siddhartha. We'll come to that. But before that, Padatik was your next venture. And with Padatik, in ways was an extension of the character of Siddhartha, but in a more reflective mode. Would you agree with that? Or like...
See, okay, again, the thing is that as you grow older, memories obviously accumulate. So every time you ask me a question, it reminds me of something that happened before that, which is why I keep talking about backstories. So, I was saying that the sort of entry point to both Rai and Mrinalda was this magazine that we were going to. So at that time, I had got to know Mrinalda and had started visiting Mrinalda as well. And he was a much more chatty person than Rai, who was by nature much more reserved. I mean, we've had long and interesting conversations, but Mrinalda was more outgoing, spontaneous, chatty. So we used to talk about this, that, and the other. And soon after Pratidwandi, he was going to make Interview, a film called Interview, which again was a departure from the sort of films that he'd been making till Calcutta film, just as Pratidwandi was Rai's and first urban Calcutta film. And of course, there was in the back of my mind, can't deny that if only he would cast me in Interview, it would be so wonderful. Mrinalda said, I don't even know whether I asked him, but Mrinalda said, I can't. I said, Cano. He said 2 reasons. First, though, you've just done Pratidwandi with Rai. Secondly, and I've got to say this in Bangla, he said, আরেকটা বড় কারণ হচ্ছে যে তুমি না বড্ড ভালো ইংরেজি বলো. Meaning that you speak very good English. For my character, who's a lower middle class, I said, what can I do? I mean, I can try and disguise my diction. He said, no. And I agreed to. He said, but don't worry, we'll work in the future. Then along came Padatik and my first opportunity to work with him. In response to the question you asked, the politics or Siddhartha's politics in Pratidwandi, I would say, are kind of subterranean. I mean, they don't come to the surface as an explicit topic. Whereas the politics in Padatik is out there.
Yeah.
He is a political activist. He is questioning the party's line now, but he has been a political activist. So, but they are both children of their times. They're both confused. All of that is true, but that is a major difference between the two characters.
Having started out with two very political characters, so to say, like subterranean and out there, what were your political? Were you shaped by the politics of the time as an individual? You were working in Metal Box, which is absolutely non-aspirational in terms of political. It's a different world. At the same time, you were essaying characters which at that time became cult for the character for the times the films were made in. 1970 was the time for a Siddhartha and Padatik's character. So what were you also politically sort of integrated with their worldviews? And a follow up to that, is it necessary for an actor to be politically sort of to have a political position, to have a political ideological?
Yeah. The second question we'll get into a little later, but as far as the first question is concerned, I think for any individual who is considers himself reasonably aware, reasonably sensitive, there is always that conflict of what you believe socially, politically, ideology, and how much of it you're able to put in practice. In other words, what are the compromises you have to make? I mean, some people who are very, very definite in their minds and who I have to say are very brave, they are able to put their activism, their political beliefs and their activism out there in no uncertain terms at the cost of a great deal of personal sacrifice. There are some people who can do that. I was not one of those people.
So if I were to say, Dhritiman, are you a communist? So you would possibly have a different response than Siddharth's.
Yeah, I would say I'm not a communist. I mean, I'm not a communist. I'm not a communist in terms of practice, and also ideologically, although I would call myself from the left, I wouldn't call myself a communist. I never have been a communist, though I very clearly I belong to the left. And now, if you want, we can discuss that.
Yes, please.
But, again, part of being of the left, as I said, a lot of influences shape you even unknowingly, So I think in my case, partly that, because generation-wise, I'm I suppose, a midnight's child in the sense of having been born just at the time of independence. After that, the Nehru era, the visions of socialism, secularism, those were the values all around. Those were the values being practiced in one way or another by people one looked up to, parents, teachers, everybody else. I mean, for instance, my father and both of my uncles, that is to say, uncles as in my mother's sisters' husbands, all of them were senior government servants, senior bureaucrats. So one was inevitably looking at them, maybe not as role models, literally, but as, these are the people you want to be like. Mm-hmm. So there was this whole business of, and inevitably the Nehruvian discourse, one way or the other, came into it. Not that one was discussing, but one knew what was the 5-year plans, the vision of a new India where there would be very little disparity of socialism. All of that was in the air, and the value that one saw in the everyday practice of, as I was telling you, these 3 bureaucrats, the value of personal honesty.
Okay.
I can only say, how regrettable it is that the value of personal honesty as a value, that seems to have eroded now. I mean, people take it for granted that people are not going to be honest, particularly that politicians are not going to be honest. But personal honesty, which one saw in everyday things. I mean, I don't know whether this is getting too detailed or too mundane, but, for a long time at home, we didn't have a fridge. Why? Because my father said that in those days, what I get paid is not enough to own a fridge. Okay. So after some time, a hired fridge came. Similarly with a car. We didn't have a car for a long, long time because there was this belief that, I have to live according to my means and I must not be seen by other people, particularly family, friends. I must not be seen as being ostentatious. So modesty was a cherished value then. That do not be ostentatious, be plain living. So, those things, you kind of get, you sort of absorb those things without thinking too much about this. Now, while saying all this, I have to confess, I have forgotten what we started with, what your original question was.
No, we're just talking about, how important it is to be for an actor to have political ideologies.
Okay, yeah, we were talking about conflict, that,
Yeah.
that there is often a conflict between what you believe and how much you can actually do. So therefore, I was never a political activist. I had political and ideological beliefs of the way, let us say, a society should be shaped. And so that was there. Not all of it was I able to put into practice. I was working for a Boxwala company, but then the Boxwala company also I left fairly early in the game.
Okay.
And went on to working in advertising, which again, but then you can argue that advertising again is as much of a, in very leftist terms, you could call advertising again also a handmaiden of capitalism. Use words like that. True, I confess.
Dhritiman, the first 2 films that you were part of became sort of cult films reflecting the times, and they gave you a stardom, to so to speak. And so, as we started this conversation with Satyajit Ray, defining you as sort of positioning you as the epitome of the star. But given that, your subsequent forays into acting was very sporadic. You never sort of invested yourself fully in an acting career. Was it a conscious choice, and why was that?
Okay. It was, to answer your question, it was a conscious choice for 2 reasons. One is the so-called commercial cinema of that time. Mm-hmm. Just aesthetically, ideologically, whichever way you want to see it, I didn't feel that I had a role in it. I mean, okay. As I told you, the involvement in film society movement and so on and so forth. Somehow, I was not sure in what way, but somehow I felt that I was a part or would like to be associated what was then called the parallel cinema, as opposed to the commercial or mainstream cinema. So that was, if you want, for want of a better word, for ideological reasons. In practical terms, I knew or I felt that I would not be comfortable in the commercial cinema environment. To give you an example, I did one or two so-called commercial films just to see, just to sort of test the waters. I found myself intensely uncomfortable.
In Bengali?
In Bengali.
Acha.
In one film, I remember, I actually, I'm not joking, literally, I had to do a song routine around a tree. I mean, So I was not going to be, but I know that might sound like an excuse because we know stories of people who've made it big as actors and have become stars who have stuck to it in spite of various misgivings, in spite of failures to begin with. So maybe that's a failure on my part. Maybe it's an excuse. Maybe it's a failure. But I would have felt very uncomfortable going there. That was one. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is by that time, in my kind of non-film acting career, we were talking about Metal Box. By that time, I had moved from Metal Box. Therein hangs a tale as well, which we may or may not come to. But I had moved from Metal Box to advertising. Well, that my years in advertising can be a whole interview in itself. But when I went into advertising with what is J. Walter Thompson, and at that time it was known as Hindustan Thompson Associates in Kolkata, they needed a film executive. My claim to fame in being a film executive was that I had acted in 2 films by reputed filmmakers. Not that made me a filmmaker, but who was to know the difference? So that was one. And I had voiced or done the commentary for what used to be done in those days, which are storyboards.
Yeah.
Storyboards which were done from transparencies, film transparencies, to kind of approximate what the final product should be. So I had voiced one such, which had been produced by Kabir Bedi, I still remember. So the assumption was, so I knew something about this medium. So there I was. I became film executive, by which time, again, it is somewhat like the transition from engineering college to presidency college. Metal Box was getting boring, but I was doing well, and I was feeling really scared at the thought of becoming successful in Metal Box, which I would have done very swiftly, and getting stuck to that, because once you're in that mode, it brings, certainly at that time, it brings so many luxuries, so many things that is very difficult to get out. So I knew that the time to get out was now. Similar things happened. There were friends working in advertising and having a good time. So I was introduced to the powers that be at Hindustan Thompson. And there I was being a film executive at Hindustan Thompson. I was good at it. So fairly quickly, I saw myself as head of the creative department in Thompson. Something that and that advertising was something that I enjoyed hugely. Not just as an activity, as a communication activity, yes, but even apart from that, when you're in advertising, you get to know, you build up your kind of fund of experience about people, things, companies. You're traveling to odd places, visiting factories and mines and shooting there, or, shooting for community development projects. So you're doing doing government. One of the most interesting projects I've done in my life was for a government of India family planning. It was a huge campaign, so shooting in remote villages, things like that. So I was thoroughly enjoying myself, and I had absolutely no intention of giving that up for a possible career as a film actor. Absolutely none, because I saw at that time a clear distinction between the mainstream cinema and the parallel cinema. While as a filmmaker, you could decide to align with one or the other. As an actor, you could not. There was no such thing as an acting career in the parallel cinema. I mean, you could be an actor, who tended towards parallel cinema, but you couldn't shun commercial cinema. I mean, people from my time, kind of contemporaries, Shabana, Smita too. I mean, she started in the parallel cinema, but had to. Once you decide that, and this several people, a little my senior, have told me. I mean, people of Dhritiman Chaterji's generation. I'll give you an example. I can't talk about it now because he's no longer with us. Shubhendu Chatterjee, who was a fine actor, but he was a doctor. I mean, very few people know that. He was a doctor. In fact, on the sets of Pratidwandi, I once felt a little ill. The person who looked after me was Shubhendu. Okay. Right? So Shubhendu once, much later, when we were all shooting together, Shubhendu, Deepankar, me, for Ganashatru, he had told me, and this has to be said in, Shubhendu could be a very humorous person. I don't know how to convey the sense of what he said in English. So I'll say it in Bangla. He said that, Tora ina bhalo korechis. এই সমস্ত এই অ্যাক্টর হব, স্টার হব, এইটা না ভেবে না তোরা ভালো করেছিস। আমি দেখ কিরম ডাক্তার যদি হতাম, সফল ভালো ডাক্তার হতাম, কেন যে আমি ভাবলাম যে অ্যাক্টার হব। এখন অ্যাক্টার হয়ে লোকে যা বলে তাই করতে হচ্ছে। সেদিন একটা ইটের গাদায় আমায় দাঁড় করিয়ে দিল, সামনে নোংরা গু টু পড়ে রয়েছে, আমি ইটের গাঁথায় দাঁড়িয়ে আছি আর ভিলেন আমার পেটে ঘুষি মারছে। আমায় এইসব করতে হচ্ছে, আর আমার ছেলে কলার তুলে গাড়ি চালিয়ে ঘুরে বেড়াচ্ছে। তো ভালো করেছিস। I don't know whether I have to render that into English, but so there was that regret. So this whole business of putting all your eggs in one basket. So I have always fought shy of putting all my eggs in one basket. And this business of not at all being convinced about commercial cinema was one of the reasons why I pulled back. I wanted to have that option always of being able to pick and choose, which in a larger sense is an option I want in life as well, of being able to pick and choose, of being selective, of not being tied down to or obligated to one thing. So I was aware of the fact that I would be making a limited number of films. Soon after Pratidwandi and Padatik, I got offers from Bombay, which I very politely and respectfully turned down.
And you have no regrets about not doing
Well,
looking back, would you have taken a different decision? If
It's always very difficult to look back and say, oh, I would have or I should have done this because circumstances changed. I mean, all I can say is that it would have been a different life. It would not have been the life that I've read and led. What I do regret is the fact that this absolute divergence between mainstream and parallel, at some point, somewhat later, it kind of narrowed.
in fact, and is that why we have seen more of you in other language cinemas? That is something I'd like to discuss.
Yeah, well, what I am all for this, the fact that this divergence is narrowed, there is convergence, there is there is a crossover of all sorts of people, not only actors, but technicians, directors of photography, all kinds of people from one cinema to the other. That is number one. Number two is a later generation of filmmakers. There is good and bad to that also, but in Bengal, certainly, a later generation of filmmakers, starting, I would say, with kind of Rituparna Ghosh, refused to be labeled either as mainstream or as parallel. They were making the kind of films which they thought were serious, worthwhile films with good taste, and films for all sorts of audiences. So if my acting career had begun in that kind of phase, maybe it would have been different, because maybe I wouldn't have felt the need to be so selective. Maybe I would have done more work. Maybe that would have become my only career. But, in all aspects of life, there are so many maybes that there's no point in what has happened. I mean, this is it.
In fact, do you think that freed yourself, this thing of not being devoted to the star or the star system, freed yourself to do the kind of roles like in Shori Shreep or 36 Chowringhee, which were entirely different from the trajectory you would normally have taken post Siddhartha and
yeah. In fact, if I had been sort of on that success stardom sort of route, I would have been wary of accepting. You mentioned Shori Shreep, that sort of role. But as I said, I'm at the cost of repeating myself. This business of leaving options open has always.
Would you like to talk about Shori Shreep? That is something that really fascinates. How did you grasp the nuances of that character? It's a character with no redeeming features at all. Just as an actor talking about looking back.
Yeah. Well, Shori Shreep was an exception to this, what I was talking about some time ago, of not going back to the original.
Yeah.
Shori Shreep, I was to some extent familiar with Mani Bandwat. So that whole his oeuvre, I understood a little bit, his kind of very stark, and he was a Marxist, and his stark take on the world and on the subaltern world, on the middle class world. So, and I read that, you're quite right, I read that story again and again to arrive at what I felt was the essence of it. This very ruthless, almost cruel look at relationships.
And a very thinking look. He's not cruel for the sake of. He thinks through his character. He thinks through his person.
So it needed a number of readings in order to be able to decode it to the best that I could. But because again, Nobindu Chatterjee, again, I think I can say this because he's also left us. Politically, he was a progressive. He was a leftist. He wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but he was certainly a sympathizer. And he chose very unusual stories to make films from, but I am sorry to say that I do not think that he did justice as a filmmaker to all the properties that he chose. It, analyzing why is going to take too much time, but I think that is a fact that even Shori Sri the film didn't grasp
Despite that character being this.
yeah.
And almost as a continuation, like your inclination to try something uh, out of the star thing is reflected again in Ganashatru. You just mentioned being cast in it. Very interesting that Siddhartha of Pratidwandi becomes this very establishment person in Ganashatru. Did you think of it that way, or did you just
See, the one thing there is that, and I say this with no hesitation, that I would have done anything that Rai asked me to do. Bottom line. I mean, not only because he was of his filmmaking abilities, but as a person, as I said, I used to drop in, we used to have long conversations about this, that, and the other. So I respected him hugely as a person. And I would never say no to anything that he asked me to do. So that was the overriding reason, firstly. Secondly, it was also, chronologically, it was also, if you look back at it, it was also coming to the time where this convergence between the two sorts of cinema was starting to happen. And I was saying to myself that, let's not choose or discard films on the basis of so-called parallel and mainstream. But let's see, I am past the age of being a hero, okay? So let me sort of look at roles which have range, where I can do things I've not done before, where, which are unusual, which I find challenging, all of that. So along came this, what is now called a negative character. So I said, yes, of course. Rai had asked me, secondly, this. So, but then again, when the customary script reading happened, I didn't, again, in true Rai style, I felt as if the role had been written for me, because whatever, but on that occasion, he did a little more physically, as in the beard, exactly this beard you're going to have. He did one thing, I've often talked about this, it just shows, after the script reading, when we were sort of doing, looks and wardrobe and so forth, one of the first things he did was he had an assistant come and measure me out for an elevated heel in the shoe. I didn't pay much heed, and I didn't really know why. But it came home much later, towards the end, where there is that scene where the Dhritiman Chaterji character and I are addressing a public meeting. He starts to speak, and then I come from the back and sort of almost seize the mic from him. And he was doing a trolley shot there. He wanted our heights to be more or less similar because of the framing that he was going to do. And he had thought of that even before the shooting had begun. That is the kind of detail in which his mind operated. So I remember only once during that shoot. I was quite comfortable with what I was doing in the shoot, and he seemed to be quite comfortable as well. But just for reassurance sake, once I thought, let me sort of grasp my courage in my hands and go and ask him. So very tentatively, I just asked him, Manikda, thik hoche to? So he said, Jodi na hai tale bolbo. That was all.
You're talking about this convergence between mainstream and parallel cinema happening sometime during, and is that the reason we have seen more of you, say 2005 onwards, I think is when it started, with Black you ventured into Hindi cinema, and you've also acted in a Sinhala film and The Man Who Knew Infinity. If you could just take us through this phase of your career where it's been Black and Pink and if also played a mainstream Hindi villain in Agent Vinod, which is it doesn't get any more mainstream than that. And plus your acting in a Sinhala film, how that came about. If this is a phase that you've seen you more busy than that early phase of your career, if you could just.
Well, Black, since you mentioned Black, I was surprised myself when when I was called for Black. The casting was being done by, if I remember correctly, Anita Cycle, were a casting company. And there was no question of auditions or anything. I mean, I just came to Bombay, had a long chat session with Sanjay, who gave me the script, and that was that. So people seemed to be pretty certain that they wanted me to play the role that I did. Sanjay's cinema, before that, I can't say that I was a fan of Sanjay's cinema. I did not like Devdas. So I can't say I was a fan. But I knew that his cinema had a lot of texture and a lot of scale. So, and I thought it would be a good idea to explore that sphere. And of course, there was Amitabh, with whom I had not worked, and Rani, both very, quite apart from their star stature, wonderful actors. I mean, people whose skill I respected. So I thought it would, and Sharnaz, not to mention Sharnaz. I mean, as an actor, again, I'd seen her on stage. So all, and for me, it was a foray into an unknown kind of territory. So that was how it happened. In practical operational terms, as I said, all experience is enriching. So I realized how different it was from the world of Bangla cinema, which I had inhabited till then. The scale, the expenditure, all of that. I mean, the time it took. I mean, something that in Bangla cinema, because of budgetary reasons, would have to be done in a day. In this kind of cinema, would take a week. So all of that. I mean, I can again go on about this. So those were the learnings. Not that there were no difficulties. Because, for instance, one of the things which had started with Raya and Sen, and then had become second nature, one again very practical thing, was dialogue. Neither Rai nor Sen had any problem. If you turned the dialogue around a little bit, to suit, not improvise, but turn it around, twist the words around a little bit to suit yourself. As far in Black, first of all, I had done small things in Hindi before that, but this was the first time I was doing a big thing in Hindi. So there was some tension there internally. And whenever I tried to make things easy for myself, I found that was something in this kind of cinema, I found that was something you just did not do.
Like, for example, if you could
I can't remember the example, but the screenplay, you see, the thing is that in Hindi cinema, and I mean, all credit to Hindi cinema, screenplay writers and dialogue writers take their work and their product very seriously. So it is set in stone. Because that is part of their portfolio. That is what leads to the next film. I mean, I have heard stories of this, again to digress, but again not to digress. My very dear friend of long-standing Tinu Anand, whose father Indaraj Anand was one of the leading and Raj Kapoor's dialogue writer. Tinu used to tell me that when Indaraj wrote for Tinu when he started making films, and there in Bombay, it was accepted practice that when you were developing a script or discussing it, for some odd reason, you booked a suite in Sun and Sand Hotel in Juhu and went and spent whatever many days it took and did that. So they did the same. And he said there were fights with his father on the scene just before the interval. And the dialogue in that scene was crucial because it had to end on a high point so that after the interval, people were glued to their seats. So every word was essential. Tinu has told me a story about in the early days when Amitabh went to Bombay. Indraji had written dialogue for a film. Amitabh again, I mean, his Hindi is very good, always has been, but he comes from the same sort of boxwala background. Yes. So he had, in some early film, he had again shifted something around. Indraji stopped him and said, "How dare you? How can you say that you cannot speak my Hindi? More than that, do you realize whose son you are? Harivansh Rai Bachchan's son? How dare you say that this Hindi is too difficult? Pack up shooting today, go home, learn this dialogue the way I have written it and come back tomorrow." So, I mean, it was a different culture. I'm sure it's changed now, but I am talking about what happened in Black Days and my learning from it. The time it took and the elaborate arrangements. And there was absolutely no scope in that. I mean, I'm talking about that kind of big Hindi cinema. There's very little scope for improvisation. Because everybody, I talked about the dialogue writer, the director of photography knew precisely where he wanted the actors and had put marks there. So it was not up to you, it was up to you as an actor to hit those marks, not up to you to change the movements. So, and the successful actors, I mean, we talk about what a nice life stars in Bombay have. I'm sure financially they do, but they also have to work very hard because this ragadawing, this discipline, everybody has to go through and conform to that discipline.
How did this Sinhala film come about? It's one of those rare. You happen to be one of the rare who has worked in Hindi, Bangla, English also happened in between with Man in Infinity. Sinhala of all.
Also Malayalam film.
Yeah. So
Sinhala is that again professionally. My wife and I had lived for about 3 or 4 years in Sri Lanka. Again, doing advertising work, being in charge of advertising for a very large company. And we loved the country, made very good friends there. Although we haven't been there for a while, it is somehow, emotionally, it's still a second home. Okay. Anyway, so there again, because of one's background, one had visited Lester James Peary's, visited him at home. In any case, one had seen his Gamparellia, which people compared to Pathit Machali before that. He was a good friend of Rai. etc., etc. And then one was slowly coming into contact with contemporary Sri Lankan filmmakers, particularly Prasanna Vithanage. And, I mean, if in our country we think that parallel filmmakers or independent filmmakers have a hard time, you should go to Sri Lanka. I mean, they really, it's a struggle all the time. So I got to know Prasanna whenever we used to discuss new films that he made. When he had projection room screenings, he used to call me, and so forth. So then we had left Sri Lanka, come back to India, but our Sri Lankan contacts were still very much alive. When Asoka Handagama got in touch and said that, there is this role and Prasanna has suggested you for this role. So I absolutely jumped at it because here was a great chance to go back to Sri Lanka and to work with people, that is to say, individuals, Sri Lankans and individuals, as individuals, people that I absolutely loved. I mean, we both, my wife and I, love being with Sri Lankans. They're such wonderful people. And also then I saw Asoka's films. I think he sent DVDs or on the net or something and found that he was a difficult filmmaker. Really difficult filmmaker, also intensely political. He was one of the few Sinhala filmmakers making films on the Sinhala-Tamil conflict and being sympathetic towards the Tamil position. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, one of his films got banned for that reason. So I said, yes, absolutely, yes, of course. And of course, the great chance to work with the diva of Sri Lankan cinema, Swarnamali Arachi, who had again taken a sabbatical from acting for some time and was kind of making a comeback. So it was Swarna and me playing man and wife. I said, brilliant. I mean, there couldn't be anything better. And again, as it happens, there are uncanny similarities which go back to history and prehistory between Sinhala and Bangla. Uncanny. So if you know Bangla, it becomes that much easier to absorb Sinhala. And during our stint in the... I can't claim that I kind of spoke Sinhala fluently or anything, but I was not too uncomfortable with it. So that even though during the shoot we had to use devices like people holding the dialogue outside of frame and things like that, but it was quite comfortable. It was quite comfortable. So again, and working in a so-called parallel film in another industry was a rich experience. So it was a combination of various things. Being back in Sri Lanka, working with Swarna, working with a very different very interesting filmmaker, all of these put together.
And how did Man Who Knew Infinity come out? Again, an international production.
Man Who Knew Infinity, let me think. Again, there was no, it was a casting director from Bombay. Again, there was no auditioning or anything. Casting director from Bombay cast me for this role. There again, I always find the experience of working in different filmmaking environments, whether it could be Bombay, it could be Marathi, it could be Tamil, whatever. But that's always interesting because every different industry has its own culture, has its own way of working. So that is always interesting. Also, Dev was in the film, so this young man, let's see what his acting chops are like. So there was that. Matthew, who directed The Feeling, I had no idea of how good or bad he was as a director, but he seemed a very, very, very serious person, very committed to what he was doing. So all of these things put together.
With Professor Shonku's new film releasing end of 2019 and now we're moving into 2020, it's been 50 years of you being in cinema as an actor. If you were to talk about the changes you've seen in terms of actors and their methods and changes in technology and or the change in the whole cultural system that operates around cinema, politically, ideologically, content-wise.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, it'll have to be what you have just asked is a really wide canvas. So to be able to speak about 50 years will take 50 minutes at least. So I won't do that. But in if one is to pick out the main things that that I have observed as a trend, and with particular reference to Bangla cinema, which has really, I mean, I've worked in Hindi, I've worked in English, I've worked in Tamil, I've worked in Sinhala, etc. I've worked in Malayalam, all of that. But my main field has been Bangla. So therefore, let me just confine myself to that. I would say three things from my personal experience. One is that the kind of cinema that I began in Bangla and kind of extended my association with, not having had very much experience of mainstream cinema, is an intense social consciousness.
Okay.
Call it social consciousness, call it political consciousness, call it ideological, whatever it is, but being grounded in, being mindful of, and expressing views on social reality, social/political reality. That, to me, I mean, all of Satyajit Ray, any film that you take of Satyajit Ray, any film that you take of Mrinal Sen, almost any film that you take of Topun Sinha, has directly or indirectly an awareness of, an interpretation of, and a comment on contemporary society and contemporary politics, even if it is set in an earlier period. Yeah. As an aside, Mrinalda, in spite of being, as I told you, a very sort of open, non-hierarchical, garrulous almost person, he has said things to me which, in retrospect, are very valuable and wise things. For example, he told me once that, Acha, what do you think is the most contemporary film of Satyajit Ray? So there were contemporary, a lot of, contemporary, when somebody says contemporary film, you think of set in the contemporary period. He said, no, to me, his most contemporary film is Aparajito. Even if it is set in the past, because he said that to me, contemporary means a contemporary interpretation of a reality, even if that reality is 100 years behind. So that is why I consider Aparajito to be his most contemporary film. Okay. So if you look at any film of Satyajit Ray, or Mrinal Sen, or Ritik Ghatak, of course, how could I forget that? Yes, thank you for reminding me. How could I forget Ritik Ghatak? Topun Sinha. There is a grounding in and a concern for social reality. I'm not making value judgments, but that in Bangla, the same can be, of course, how can one not mention the next generation of Gautam Ghosh, Aparna Sen, Buddhadev Dasgupta, Utpalendu when he was making films. But that link with contemporary reality I don't want to be unfair, I may be misjudging things, but to me, that link has been getting weaker.
Okay.
So that's one broad trend that I see. I mean, people have become much more concerned about, personal problems, relationship problems, and so on, which they have their own value. But this being aware of and saying, this is happening and this is not right, and this is happening, this should have been like that. So, that is one thing. I mean, Amitabh Ghosh, after the release of Ghana Island, he was in Kolkata at a release event. I was not there. I mean, I know Amitabh, but I was not there. But he said almost the same thing, that, talking about writer's commitment, writer's ideology. He said that, some books or some works of fiction make you, tell you that the writer is saying that I'm watching, which I thought was a very, very, very interesting way of putting it. So therefore, this feeling that this filmmaker is saying, this is happening, I am watching, and I am forming my own conclusions. That act of watching seems to have grown weaker.
Okay.
That's one. Two, of course, obviously, that's not only about Bangla cinema, but about all cinema, is the evolution of technology and what it has meant. Because technology has not only meant the convenience of doing things, the speed with which you do things, etc. But as we all know, it has also changed the aesthetics of cinema and the way that you make films, the practical nuts and bolts way in which you make films. The cinema I have grown up with was, to borrow a term from Grotowski, was the poor cinema. Grotowski talked about the poor theatre was the poor cinema, because people like Satyajit and Hrithik Ghatak had to be very frugal in the way they were, because raw stock was as expensive as gold. You had to be very frugal, so you had to have that discipline. You couldn't take too many shots. You couldn't.
You had to be aware of your cuts. You had to
Yes, and you had to limit your schedule to X number of days. Digital has changed all that, because you can go on shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting without spending too much extra money, and then putting it all together on the editing table. Now, some will say that that's a good thing. I mean, why not? If technology enables you to do that, why not? But has it also meant the erosion of a certain kind of discipline? Well, I mean, I know actors of my generation who get quite irritated by the way films are shot these days. I mean, they say, they don't know what they're doing. Ekhan theko shot niche, ekhan theko shot niche, ekhan theko shot niche, ekhan theko shot niche, tapar naki pore thik hobe. But what they don't, when doing that, what they don't realize is that is the extra strain they're putting on the actors. I mean, it's after all, if you're taking multiple shots, because you don't know what you're going to keep finally, who's bearing the brunt of that? It is us poor actors who are bearing the brunt of that. So that equally is this, with film viewing. The media of film viewing, with those changing, with the big screen, which is what we grew up watching, with the importance of that diminishing, with smaller screens, whether it's the television screen or the laptop, and now the mobile phone, the whole aesthetics of perception is changing. I mean, I had an interest in cinema, so I knew about these things, but even a general audience knew high resolution, when he or she saw high resolution, knew that a shot could be a deep focus shot, where the person in front and the person in the background are both in focus. But those phenomena belong to film and to the large screen.
Yeah.
They don't belong to the small screen. So the aesthetics and the criterion of what is good visually, what is bad visually, that is changing. So that is a major change that is happening. So social awareness, technology. The third thing that I find is that the whole filmmaking process has become much more elaborate.
Okay.
The number of people on the set. I mean, to give you an example, when I went to do Nunca Dubi with Ritu in Banaras, there were people hanging around. To me, it seemed that other than scratching their armpits from time to time, they were doing very little. So I asked Ritu, ki? He said, Jina, Akshojunar unit. Akshojunar unit, even when we were making Akaler Sandhane, which had some scale, would have been unthinkable, would have been absolutely unthinkable. So that part of it is for union reasons, this and that.
That's right. That's what I was coming to. Why is that?
Part of that is for, now that's a sensitive area, I don't want to go into it, but that is laying down union rules, that's a reason. And the expectations of everybody, of actors, I mean, we have grown up when making films with Satyajit and Mrinal Sen, even Apurna later, of being very, very frugal, in the sense that one car, one non-air conditioned ambassador car would pick up people and land up at the sets. Now everybody has to, now the kind of car that is sent for you establishes your position in the hierarchy. Whether you're going in an SUV or whatever it is, that shows, it's somewhat like, since we are sitting and talking in Delhi, and I've always felt that you didn't feel it this much in Kolkata, but you've always felt that in Delhi, that your postal address indicated who you were in life. In the olden days, your postal address, because there were so many government residences, your postal address could actually say whether you were chief secretary, under secretary, what. So the film industry is facing that kind of a hierarchical situation, which it did not used to in the past. I mean, even up until we were talking about Ganashatru a little while ago. Ganashatru, there was this large, sort of somewhat leaky makeup room in Indrapuri studios, where Shobhenduda, Deepankar, I were all housed there. We were taking off our clothes and putting on our costumes and putting on makeup and having a jolly good time sort of chatting. Now everybody has to have his own vanity van, which when I first encountered this whole phenomenon of van, of course, it's very much more comfortable and all that. But it also, sometimes there's a feeling of unreality, in the sense that I go into my van, especially if it's a Hindi film, I go into my van, do my makeup, probably even go to sleep, and I'm called for my shot, let's say at 3 o'clock. Somebody comes, and sir, shot. When I get out of the van, there's a sense of disorientation. Where am I? What is this place? What am I doing? Okay, fine. Then this assistant on the walkie-talkie says, Mr. Chatterji is walking. Of course, Mr. Chatterji is walking. What else would Mr. Chatterji be doing? Okay, Mr. Chatterji is walking. So Mr. Chatterji walks behind this assistant. At some point, assistant says, please stop. Mr. Chatterji stops. I'm wondering what's happening because we haven't come to the sets as yet. said assistant exits. Another assistant comes and takes over, right? And goes. So and this is, I'm not joking, huh? This is actual experience. And Mr. Chatterjee is on the sets but Mr. Chatterjee can't see the director. Where is the director? Earlier on, the director, Shotoitra, used to operate his own camera, but even apart from that, the director was right next to the camera. Now, courtesy video monitors and so on, director may be miles away. So, Mr. Chatterjee, director kidhar hai? Haan, sir, hai udhar pe. All the communication is happening with walkie-talkie, this, that. Acha, theek hai. Director was there. अच्छी बात है. तो shot क्या है? I asked the assistant. नहीं सर, आप यूँ वहाँ पे एक कैरेक्टर खड़ी है, आप उसको देखेंगे, फिर आप रिएक्ट करेंगे. अच्छी बात है. तो रिएक्ट करूँगा, तो रिएक्ट करके लेफ्ट ऑफ कैमरा देखूँ या राइट ऑफ कैमरा देखूँ? हाँ सर, आप एक काम कीजिए, आप एक टेक में लेफ्ट कर दीजिए, एक टेक में राइट कर दीजिए. सो यू नो, इट इज, it might seem like a so-called senior person criticizing, but I'm not. I mean, sometimes it's very funny, you know. But there is a definite change and, you know, sort of the kind of solid connect there used to be, seems to be. But then again, I mean, I am saying this because I have seen the span of 50 years, but I mean, actors who've grown up in this context maybe feel quite comfortable with it, and probably they think that there's nothing wrong with this. This is the way it is. This is the way it should be. So,
welcome back to Cinemaazi Studios Editor Social with Dhritiman Chaterji. Dhritimanda, what to you is the most fulfilling thing about being an actor?
I think for the first time in this conversation, I've actually had to take a pause before answering a question. I haven't had to do it before. You know, it's very difficult to pinpoint one single thing. To me, what is important is to, obviously, is to become somebody else, not only for myself, but for the audience, importantly for the audience. Which is why, you know, there are various views. You know, you talk of actors being typecast, for example. So you have the example of very successful actors who've spent a lifetime just reproducing themselves over and over and over and over and over again. But people seem to like that. So therefore, who am I to say that that is wrong? It is one kind of mode, let us say, of acting. But I won't say that I've got a great many opportunities to do that, but to me, what is very satisfying is to step out of my skin and become somebody else, because that's a huge challenge. Which is why, for instance, again, I have not personally have had many opportunities to do that, which is why I love the whole thing of makeup and disguise as an actor, of even physically becoming completely transformed, becoming physically a different person, and therefore internally you have to become and you know, I mean, that the important thing to remember is that is much more than just acting technique.
Yeah.
It really is an act of will, almost, of becoming someone else. You might even say that there is an element of schizophrenia in it, of split personality in it, that, you know, you just split a part of your personality and become something else. So that is an area of being an actor which I find fascinating, which is why, as we were talking earlier, there is, at one point in my career, I became interested in this possibility of a range, of being able to explore a range. So that is one. Two is the Two is the craft. You know, I am not, like many in my generation, I am not a trained actor in the sense that I did not go to acting school, I did not go to film school. So my techniques, and obviously there are techniques involved, my techniques are self-learned. Whether it is portraying a character, whether it's projecting my voice, whatever it is, it's all self-learned. I mean, things which I have found by trial and error and things that work for me. But seeing every time whether I'm hitting the right note, at least according to me, by employing those techniques, that is very, very satisfying to me.
Are there qualities essential to being an actor, do you think? And how does one learn? If there are, there must be something that sets an actor apart from, somebody who doesn't act. Are there qualities that can be imbibed, learned, or are there qualities at all? Or
no, there are. I think there are. Again, I won't be able to talk about this from a very technical point of view, since I'm not a trained actor. But I feel, from what I have found, is that if you have a very, how shall I put it, if you have a very hard set personality as an individual, then it is probably difficult to be an actor. You have to be malleable. You have to be a kind of an open field on which various sorts of seeds can germinate. I don't know whether I'm being very obscure, but that's the best way I could put it.
Sort of give yourself up to a director and his vision and a lot of external elements, no? Is that?
Of course. But so therefore, which is why I said that I depend a great deal on a screenplay and a director's vision. But having said that, a director can communicate with you and tell you what she wants, but then she can't do it for you. Finally, you have to do it. And you have to do it with whatever tools you use, whether it's techniques you've learned, whether it's techniques you've picked up, whatever it is. Finally, you have to do it. And then, of course, another topic which I am hugely interested in, but again, discussing that will probably take the next hour, is the difference between acting in cinema and acting in theatre. That's also a fascinating topic, but I don't know whether we want to go into that.
And as an actor, how important are rehearsals to you? Do you see yourself as an instinctive, by the moment actor, or do you believe in rehearsals and, to put it in more technical terms, between method acting and instinctive acting, rehearsed acting? What's your take on that?
Okay, let me answer that in two ways, Matt. As I told you, what I try to do is to become that person. Forget myself and become that person. But then again, in cinema acting, you can't fully do that because you have to be aware of the practical things all the time. You have to be aware of this is where you're going to put your foot down and you're not going to go ahead an inch further than that spot. This is the light that you've got to take, those purely practical things. So it's always a split situation. On the one hand, it's all very well to say that you're getting out of yourself and getting into the skin of somebody else. You're doing that. But the physical reality around you, meaning on the set where you're shooting, that you have to be keenly aware of all the time. So it's as with most things in life, it's a bit of this and a bit of that you have to. So method, instinct, your other query that you raised about rehearsals and so on, by and large, these days, certainly in Bangla cinema, I find this whole business of workshopping has become quite popular. I for some directors, it may work, especially if you're working with an ensemble of actors, or if you're acting with new actors. But if you're doing a lot of scenes with groups of people, then I'm sure it's valuable. But personally, this workshopping thing has never really worked for me, or I've never really felt it necessary. If I'm comfortable, if I've immersed myself in the script, the director's vision, and in the character itself, then I like actually the unpredictability that lack of rehearsal does for you. Because sometimes I surprise myself with what I'm doing in a shot. Okay. Sometimes it's a pleasant surprise, sometimes it's a not pleasant surprise, or sometimes it's a success, sometimes it's a failure. But that unpredictability I like. But then again, this business of workshopping and so forth, you can't, as an actor, you can't think only of yourself. You have to think of your co-actors as well. So you have to be very aware of what's happening between you and the other person or persons. So a lot of things go into it.
What qualities do you look for or do you hope for in a director when you are accepting a film or a role? And as a corollary to that, among the directors you have worked with, say apart from Ray and Mrinal Sen, who had these qualities more than the others? What qualities sets apart a good director, and you would hope for some?
I keep getting asked. I used to keep getting asked that since you are known to be selective about what you do, what makes you choose a role or reject a role? And I used to say very lofty things like, if I believe in a film's politics, if I believe in what the director is going to say, so on and so forth, very lofty things. But I have come after 50 years, I've come to the conclusion that it is often boiling down to very basic things, like whether tomorrow I am going to look forward to going to work, or whether I'm going to think, oh, I wish there is rain, I wish the shoot is called. Simple as that. Okay. Now, this looking forward to going to work, obviously there's a combination of factors, which is the director, which is the co-actors, which is the comfort level. Simple, the basic physical comfort level that the producer is providing you with. Simple, nitty-gritty, practical things like that. There used to be a time when, because we do parallel cinema, we do low-budget cinema, producers used to think that, that actors who are on the set, particularly if you've gone on location elsewhere, producers used to think that it's some kind of a boot camp or a military camp, that you live with, with the barest minimums and work 16 hours a day. I used to have to explain to people that, it's not a question of ego, or it's not a question of being a star or anything like that. It is that to retain your energy levels and retain a sort of relaxed look in your countenance, you need to be able to sleep comfortably, you need a certain number of hours off, and so forth. So it's not a question of ego. It's just, it has to do with the work itself. So,
in all these years, despite being so choosy about your roles and having a very sort of clear-cut thing about what you want to do and what you don't want to do or comfortable with, you have never directed a film, never thought of directing a film?
Well, the answer to that is I have. Okay. And also fairly early on, which is when there was this period of uncertainty, corporate advertising, particularly in my advertising phase, during that phase, and also when I left advertising, I've made commercials, I've made educational films, I've made documentaries, but I've never made a fiction film, ever. I've had thoughts about that, but it's now why it has not happened, even I don't know. But face it, it has not happened.
What if you were to be given the opportunity of what one story would you like to film? What one novel or a piece of fiction would you like to film?
Well, I would do either. Well, these days everything is so permeable and so sort of what is the word? Everything becomes public so that I'm a little hesitant to say this, because I know that what we are doing is going to be in the public domain, and that has problems of its own. Of how media are always sort of news hungry these days. Oh, breaking news! Chaterji wants to do such and such. So I'm a little bit reluctant. But even then, since you've asked, I would like to tackle Nabarun Bhattacharya, who is a writer who's so different, and who is magic realism and surrealism. Nabarun Bhattacharya, I would handle if somebody gave me the opportunity. And one, this is top of the head, and one very early novel of Shishendu Mukhopadhyay I'd like to tackle, but I am not going to name that because... So these are the things that come to mind immediately. If somebody said, all right, go and do, tomorrow I'll start working.
Apart from cinema, what other art forms have you engaged in or have interested you, and what have they offered to you as a person and as a creative artist?
Well, background to this, background to one of these answers I told you is that I've been exposed to photography from very early on. So I still continue to, I love taking pictures. I continue to take pictures. They're not for public viewing. I mean, in the sense, not that I sort of hold them close to my chest, but I've never held exhibitions, and so on. They are seen by, as it happens, photography is an interest of my wife's. Photography is an interest of my son's, and he does some of it professionally. So we sort of look at and comment on one another's pictures, and so therefore different modes of photography I like to play around with. Maybe again, if tomorrow somebody came and said, here's the money, here's the resources, do an exhibition, maybe one will. But so that is one interest. Literature, that is to say reading, is a consuming interest. I mean, it's almost like an addiction. I do not think that I have spent very many days where I have not devoted at least an hour to reading. So and that is again an interest which grew very, very early, and it
spans languages in terms of
it's
English and Bengali.
Yes. But these days I find that excuse me, that I read less of fiction, except crime and detective fiction, which I love, and I have favorite authors. But I tend to read more history, anthropology, and philosophy.
How important are reviews to you? And we have been talking, we have had this conversation on and off, and to get you on record on the quality of film criticism in India today.
Yeah, well, there personally, because I haven't or don't do that many films, I personally as an actor, I do not have to or have not had to face this whole issue of reviewing and criticism. And there, I mean, I have to confess that all of us, whether it's cinema or whether you're a painter or whether you're a dancer, we have a split personality. Let us not deny that. We love it when we are reviewed well, and we think this reviewer is the last word in criticism. And if we are reviewed badly, then we have a tendency to say this guy does not know what he's talking about. It is the same phenomenon. I mean, if you're a public face, we will complain endlessly if people want to take selfies with us in public places and so forth. But then if people don't recognize us and pass us by, we are equally upset. So, performing artists, I think, have this split. Okay, but seriously, to answer the basic question you raised, just as a lover of cinema or of literature or of art, there used to be a time when one used to depend on certain critics. They were so reliable in one's mind because of various reasons that one could say, okay, all right, now am I going to go and see this film or not? Let us see what so-and-so has to say. He says, yes, go see, go see. He says, don't see, waste of time. That has gone.
Okay. Yeah.
That has gone. Various other things have happened. I find that a lot of reviews now are to fill up space. I mean, the reviews are just telling the story of the film. But that story I know. I mean, I'm going to see that story if I go to see the film. 3 is not having a deep knowledge of that genre. I mean, I look forward to a critic referring to reference points and comparing and saying, all right, this is the reason why this happened or did not happen, and compare it. I find that kind of knowledge among critics lacking now. I mean, in other words, I don't know how many film critics, film reviewers are knowledgeable about film history. I think that's by film history, I don't mean that you know every detail about everything, but about the tradition of cinema.
Yeah.
So there is that problem, and then of course, I suppose it was there all the time. But this business of belonging to this camp or that camp, and if I write a good review, who is it going to benefit? If I write a bad review, what are going to be the consequences? I find, for example, one leading newspaper group in Kolkata, doing what I think is an absurd thing, like asking an actor to say what he or she thinks about the film. I mean, why should I be interested in this actor's personal view? When you see something like that, you are certain that a reviewer, a serious reviewer, would have panned the film, which is why the publication pulls out from and substitutes it with some frivolous views of some personality, some celebrity, which is being dishonest, I think. And of course, also the fact that certainly in the print medium, the space given to serious film criticism has gone down. That's also, which is again, I mean, I know it sounds very nostalgic to say, oh, our days were so much better than, but I mean, the Kshatriya and Mrinal Sen fights, call it what you will, with people taking sides and going on endlessly, was so enriching, so entertaining. I remember a very interesting example now that there used to be a paper a weekly paper, a periodical called Now, which Shomoshin had become, which then became the very left paper Frontier. Okay. Now, in its incarnation now, there are various solid people who used to write on cinema. O.C. Ganguly, the artist, who also dabbled in cinema, he made a film of Kinugu Alargoli, which to me, which to my then young, unspoiled eyes, was a very refreshing film, right? So there was this fight going on in Now for many weeks between, as I remember, Ritik Ghatak and Horishadan Dasgupta. Tussle, which was because two terrific people. Nothing personal, but a real no-holds-barred fight, which was wonderful to see. Then that was a slightly naughty thing to do, I decided to pitch in under a pseudonym.
Okay.
So I became the third angle in a three-cornered fight.
Okay.
And this went on and on and on and on. And I thought, I felt very satisfied that here I am crossing swords with Ritik Ghatak. So but point I'm trying to make is that serious writing about cinema,
engagement was
yes,
there.
was there.
Yeah.
But now,
Over the last 50 years, how have your aspirations changed? What do you know now that you wish you knew when you were starting out? If I hope my question's clear.
no, I'm afraid it isn't.
How have your aspirations when you started out, the kind of aspirations you had about life, and now what kind of aspirations? So what, something that you wish you knew at that point of time, would have enabled you to better handle some aspects. Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That I am not even sure that is a question which it is possible to answer in this sense that for a person who is very sure of his objectives, very sure what he wants to do with his life and various aspects of it, there are markers to say, okay, here I've succeeded, here I've failed. And therefore, when you look back, it is possible to say, oh, if I had done these things, in retrospect, I would not have failed. But as we were discussing a little earlier, my life in that sense has been quite unplanned. Things have happened. I've done things on the spur of the moment. I'm fortunate in having particularly a partner, also a son, but particularly a partner, and before that my parents, who have gone along with that. So I've been extremely fortunate in that. So it's very difficult for me, sometimes I regret that it is difficult for me to have regrets, because I don't know what to regret. I mean, some things have happened, some things have not happened. And now it is, in some I would say that it is not that one does not have misgivings, uncertainties, insecurities about the future. Of course one does. Of course one does. It would be very dishonest to say one does not. But I keep repeating to myself that the way to do it, again, that sounds easier than it is to do in practice, but the way to do it is really be in the moment as far as possible, to concentrate and enjoy what is happening now. That will lead to the future. Very little I can do about the future.
What has been your approach to religion? Are you a believer or agnostic? And has that shaped the way you have led your life and career?
Yeah, well, I mean, I am, I suppose I'm saying this for the Hindu right, probably, that I am an Hindu Brahmin, okay? Because I was born as, not my fault, nothing to do with me, actually. that I was born as a Hindu Brahmin in a Hindu family. And till it was not a religious family, as in it. I mean, there were no pujas every morning and every night. So in that sense, it wasn't a religious family, but it observed all the customary Hindu rituals. So therefore, I was aware of those rituals. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, as we were talking some time ago, I also was born and grew up in this secular, socialist, larger atmosphere, of which my father, my uncles, everybody was a part. So, and as it happens, this both my father's side and my mother's side, if you had asked them, they would have said that they believed in God. They were Hindus who believed in God. They would have said that definitely. But both the families were non-practicing in the sense that there was no religious practice going on every day. So I was not exposed to that. I didn't grow up in that kind of, that didn't seep into me. Okay. I didn't absorb that. So it was secular, by and large. Secular Hindu. I have no hesitation in saying that. My father used to say, and he, I think, took his cue from Jawaharlal Nehru. My father used to say that I'm an agnostic, that maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't exist. I have better things to do than to think about that. So, which, as far as I know, was Jawaharlal Nehru's way of looking at it also. So I would say that I am an agnostic. I mean, I can't sort of agonize about the existence of God. I'm not practicing. I'm not a practicing Hindu. I do not have faith. I do not depend on God. I do not appeal to God. I do not pray to God. I have to depend on myself or other human beings to deal with my problems. So I have no dependence on God. But in spite of that, maybe God exists. Maybe God, even however much of a wicked child I am being, maybe God does look after me. I have no idea. But it is not one of my areas of interest. My wife, on the other hand, who's as liberal, as progressive as you can possibly be, she is. On the other hand, she is a woman of deep faith, and she has no problems in recognizing that. She practices her faith very publicly. There is no, very privately, I'm sorry, there's no public display of faith, but she's a person of great faith. Great, I have no problems with that either.
Dhritimanda, this question comes from what I saw you being part of yesterday, and a symposium on failure and on failing, and over 50 years of life in the public eye, in a variety of roles, as a corporate person, as an actor, as a filmmaker, non-fiction filmmaker. What are your thoughts on success and failure, and how do you address these two words, and for the benefit of our audience?
Well, needless to say, it's not a very simple question. Yeah. And my views on that have also changed over time. Let me start by saying that I don't know why. I mean, actually, my wife can articulate that better than I can, is that I am by nature, I think, a contradictory person. I'll give you a simple example. When I have loads of time on my hand with nothing to do, then I fret. Okay. On the other hand, if I'm very, very busy, and I complain that I don't have enough time. So it's never one thing or the other. So the same applies to this whole business of success and failure. All my life in various fields, whether it's the corporate field, whether it's advertising, whether it's being an actor. As I was telling you before, I have tended to remain as autonomous as possible and not feel obliged to being kind of wedded or anchored to one thing. Now, obviously, if you do that, then you're not going to be as successful in conventional terms as you would have been if you had committed to something. So it comes with the territory. So therefore, success, failure, now the view that I take, which is not necessarily the view that I took 10 years ago, now the view that I take is what has happened has happened. There is not much point in sort of deep introspection and worrying and regretting, because after all, the future span, let's face it, is a limited span. That is a fact of life. Death is a fact of life. And the older you grow, that fact of life starts staring you in the face. So the only solution to that now, easier said than done, is to enjoy life as much as possible, is to try and open yourself to and absorb as many new kinds of experiences as possible, to do things you have not had the opportunity to do in the past, things like that. I know that you probably don't think that's a satisfactory enough answer, but that is the way it is. I mean, failure, I could have been a more well-known actor. I could have been at the top of my profession in advertising. But then the fact that I'm not is largely because of me. I mean, I am responsible for that because I've shied away from full commitment to anything. But on the other hand, that has given me a range of experiences which maybe some other people who have been wedded single-mindedly to one thing, and that people like that have got. So it's, it comes with the territory. Some of this, some of that. More than that, I find, I'm sorry, Shantanu, I find it difficult to be more articulate than that about this subject.
Absolutely. On that note, we come to the end of this episode of Editor Social at Cinemaazi Studios. Thank you, Dhritimanda, for a wonderful day sharing your experiences, your life in films and otherwise. Thank you so much. We are privileged to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Shantanu. Thank you. And the rest of the team, whom you can't see, but they're all behind the camera, and they have been working probably harder than we have on this. For me, it's been exhausting, but it's also been enriching, because many of the very incisive questions that Shantanu asked set me probably thinking for the first time about the issues that I had not had occasion to think of before. So it's been very enriching for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.